Um, Amazing. So I'm going to just dive right in. And please, at any point, feel free to send in a question in the chat. And I'll take certain pauses to answer some of those questions. But I have allowed for at least 30 minutes of this session, hopefully so, to be a space where we can have a bunch of questions, reflections about what it is that we're going to discuss today. Apologies if sometimes you see me looking between screens. The presentation is on a different screen that I will share with you all now, but I'm fully engaged. I'm fully here. Okay, right. That is legible, hopefully. Great, great, great. So to start us off with, this is just the session at a glance, what you can expect. Kind of just really the purpose of this is to understand how we can navigate communications within, I think, an increasingly hostile context, and the ways in which we can ground ourselves in a lot of feminist praxis when we are thinking through how we communicate, why we communicate, and who we are communicating for. So I'm going to walk you through three pillars after we have a bit of an opening section for reflection, and then we will also have a closing reflection and some tangible resources that will be provided. After the fact, I will also share some articles, many of which that I'm going to refer to, or some writing text that has been provided by a lot of Black feminist thought leaders, and that can be utilized alongside the presentation as well, and really can just help in cementing kind of your feminist praxis and the ways in which you communicate. So, my first question to you all, as an opening activity, and this is a place where I really do encourage people to unmute. If you have something to say, you can just put your hand up and then we can go in that order, or you can also add it in the chat. But a question that I have for you is, what words have you stopped using? And some questions to help maybe understand that or other things, and you can answer one of these questions or all of them. What words feel dangerous right now? What language do you avoid when you're doing your proposals, your social media, or your donor engagement? And what ideas do you feel like you constantly have to translate? Basically, when you're doing the work of communicating, where do you feel restriction? And what are some of those instances? If we could share some of that. Now, because I cannot fully see, lucky if you could just help. Okay, no, I'm fine. I can see now. But yeah, are there any contributions? Anyone, please take your time to also sit and reflect. But this is just an opening for us to also get to know each other. And thank you to all who are introducing themselves in the chat as well. Okay, seeing some words here: feminism and gender, trans women. Yep, definitely. Lovely to see all the chats coming in. Yes, definitely. These are all very much common things, especially in donor reporting, even in social media framing these days. Um, Brilliant. Nobody feeling cold to the mic in any way. Definitely seeing some common themes here, which is crazy to think that we are in a place in life where simply saying the word feminism is a problem. SRHR for sure. Abortion, definitely. Equality, yes. Equity, equality, diversity, inclusion. Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so I think what we're seeing here is um, quite a few common themes, and really the overarching thing here is that in many ways, words that are descriptors, words that simply tell us about a situation or explain something, all of a sudden, I wouldn't even use the word political, have become something that we cannot say at all. Because I definitely think the work of communicating in and of itself is political. Um, but it seems now that it is the scarlet letter that we're all carrying around when we're saying simple words like equality or feminism. Um, so thank you all very much for sharing this. And like I've just mentioned, I think what we are seeing in many ways is the fact that communications is never neutral. Um, and in the same breath, silence is political, visibility is political, and legibility, basically, who gets to be understood, who gets to be taken seriously, and whose language counts as professional is deeply political. So, in thinking through that, I think through some of the words of Audre Lorde, who mentions that your silence will not protect you. And I think that's the thing, the conflict that when you're doing communications can feel very challenging, as we've highlighted all of these words that are really just descriptors or language that we use to describe whatever it is that we're doing, whatever our organizations are doing, have now become something that we can't really say. And in some ways, I think for me, where the challenge has been is sitting there and reconciling with, the statement of your silence will not protect you, which is very true. And I think in Audre Lorde saying this, she was very much correct. And I think also the audience that she hoped to also address was one that oftentimes has benefited from the privilege of being able to be silent. And I think it was a calling to say that, it doesn't end, the oppressive frameworks do not just end at certain people, certain demographics, but rather spread. But I also want to complicate kind of this framing of your silence will never protect you, because I think for many of us right now, as we're doing this work, what I would call strategic opacity is protection. For many activists, naming things too clearly can often mean that you are privy to surveillance, you are going to get defunded, there's going to be imprisonment, or you're just exposing yourself to some form of danger. So, the question that I really want us to grapple with, and hopefully we can leave feeling as though we've started a conversation to be able to answer it, is what do we do in the thing that liberates us, which is in many ways communications, because the privilege of being able to communicate and share knowledge and information is one that has not been afforded to everyone. But what happens when this thing that's meant to liberate us is also the thing that ends up exposing us? Um, that specific contradiction is not a problem that I think we can solve, but really it's just the terrain that we're working on. And so today, really hoping to be able to walk that with you, and come up with some ideas of how we can root ourselves as we're walking this journey. Because I think, especially within the world history, we see that things, tides turn consistently all the time. So before we kind of get into the main kind of substantive things or some of the legal lexicon, um, the question that I have within the first pillar is what is feminist communications? And not to be edgy in any ways, but I think what I will actually do is say what communications is not, because oftentimes I have seen that. And I think when we are given communications training, a lot of the times what we're getting is marketing training. Communications is not a logo. It's not an Instagram grid. It's not a brand guideline or a press release template. And oftentimes, as civil society organizations, we get this information as a means of how we're going to communicate. And sometimes, because we cannot detach ourselves from the colonial enterprise, um, the way in which we work tries to mirror what can be argued as kind of marketing training. And oftentimes, what this does is it positions your messaging as a delivery mechanism for a direct and immediate output. So you have your message, you package it, and you push it out. And you are then measuring its success based on how much you get back from that communication going out. But what we're doing when we're doing communications in these specific contexts really is trying to shift narratives and trying to assess and readjust power. And there is no way that that's going to give us an immediate return, because to expect that from people is to assume that the struggles that we are having, the struggles that we are fighting for, are simple, one-dimensional, and can be transformed overnight. And so when we speak about communications for feminist within feminist contexts, we're asking a completely different question. How exactly are we delivering the message is not necessarily what we're looking at, but who decides what that message is, who is it for, and who does it make legible, and who does it erase. Um, Bell Hooks speaks of language as a place of struggle, that the oppressor's language, it often wounds. And I think for a lot of Black women, women of the global majority, the very act of speaking in our own way, in our own voices, in our own cadences is an act of resistance. And I think that's something that's really important to remember. And when Bell Hooks wrote this in particular, they were speaking to the way in which we need to reclaim language, reclaim the right to name our own experiences, and make sure that we understand that this project is inseparable from the project of liberation. So, some of the things, though, that I think are good to kind of ground all of this theoretical stuff that I've been speaking about, just as a summary, is, narrative power, like I mentioned, which is what we are doing in the work. We are trying to shift narratives, such as the idea that saying feminism or using the word feminism is too radical and is anti-morality. We are also working with the tangible reality of, respectability politics, which is the fact that when certain people communicate, or when we are in the position of trying to amplify the communications for certain people, we are in spaces where we have to make ourselves palatable, or the message palatable for people. And we're dealing with all of those contradictions. There's also the legibility politics. So it's in the question of who exactly gets to be visible and whose visibility is going to jeopardize their safety. Going back to what I mentioned of, we are trying to juggle between, you know, the message that your silence will not protect you, but also the reality that in many ways, sometimes opacity or not being as transparent with certain things is also a means of protection. Um, and then I imagine also something that I wanted to name is, there's the mere act of communicating, but also when you occupy certain bodies, when you are representing certain bodies, you end up in positions where, as a communicator, sometimes you are questioned, sometimes your credibility is questioned, whether or not you can actually say certain things. And this all harkens back to, language in and of itself being used as a tool of oppression. And so, therefore, us speaking, us communicating, if there's anything to remember, is in fact a form of resistance. Now, moving on to the next slide. Oh, now we've jumped like crazy. My apologies for that. Okay, right. So based off of that little preamble that I just went through, would love to group people into certain sections, just so that I am not the only one who's talking. I'm really asking to hear people. Um, Once we get through this little group exercise, and it'll just be a few minutes, I will give us perhaps, I want to say 8 minutes. And I want us to take a look at this specific text that is on the screen. There are two lines of messaging. And the three questions that I want us to answer as we are looking at this text is, which one of these texts do you think would get someone funding? Which one do you feel would represent whoever is being spoken about? And what did the first version do to the politics of the second version? So, Lucky, if you could help me out here to just put people into groups. And I'm just encouraging everyone to kind of have conversations, take a look at this. If you don't know that, if you don't remember the questions, that's also okay. I'm going to paste them here. Um, but I just really want to open up the space to have a conversation so we can really start looking at kind of the politics of communicating and the different ways in which we're having to navigate what to say and what not to say. Back, everyone. I hope the different sessions were good. I did creepily join a few of them, but I just wanted to make sure you all had access to the questions. I'm interested to see if there's anyone who from each group who would like to share a bit of what you all discussed, some of the reflections that you had. I see you've already got something in the chat, but perhaps I'm going to start with group three because what is order if not chaos put together? So if there's anyone from group three.
I'm not sure if we were group three, ladies. Natasha, Caroline, I'm
I
not even
think we were
sure.
two. Yeah, I think we
Ah,
were
okay.
two.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we were group three, but happy for two to begin. That's fine. But I can also
Okay.
begin if that's
Who wants
okay.
to
Yeah.
go? Okay, you can go ahead. I think you've shared in the chat, so feel free to also
Yes.
elaborate
Yeah, so
further.
I can
Yeah.
maybe open, and if anyone in my group has anything, please come in. So I think the first thing that came to mind is that I think at least in my experience and context, it's the first one that would unfortunately attract more funding for two reasons. One is I think the focus and the emphasis is more on the program. So the program will achieve this and that, and if funds are directed to the program, it will help in achieving a certain set of outcomes. So because the program is the center of the sentence, funders are likely to be attracted to that. But the second sentence, it centers girls, humans, people, and I think those perspectives are seen to be too quote unquote emotional by funders, and they don't really attract a lot of funding. Although this is the reality, and we shouldn't be afraid to phrase things as they are. But unfortunately, the reality is that those that focus more on the program get funding. Um, yeah, I think that's what I was. That's what we were thinking. Also, quickly, one more thing. Uh, Solving things from an economic perspective are seen as easier than changing things from the root, right? So if you promise that, oh, I will increase the income of women, I will make them financially empowered, like these are just seen as easy magic bullets, because they're less comfortable for donors as well. Sorry, more comfortable for donors, but to engage with lasting social change is always more difficult, and it's perceived as difficult and long lasting. So they kind of shy away from those kind of expressions. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay, great. I wish we had one day. One day I'm going to invite you all to a conference and we're all going to talk about this for days on end. But for the purposes of time, perhaps we can hear from group two now.
Well,
Yes, I-
after what my lady just presented, I'm not sure. I mean, she summed up everything. I would say the way she presented it resembles the first statement, and what I'm gonna say now resembles the second statement. Um, I think my fellows and I came to the conclusion that the first one would get the funding uh, because yeah, it's more framed, it focuses on the objectives, etc. And for the second question, definitely the second statement is what would make the girls feel seen. For the third question, I think we got that it means what does the sorry, let me just get back to it very fast. What did version A do to the politics of version B? I think here we mean what did version A change or add, or how did it frame version B? I think this is how we
Mhm.
understood it, and I think the second was more emotional, and the first was more practical, pragmatic, professional. These are the key words that we linked to those two statements to understand them. Yeah,
Hmm.
that was it, I think. Natasha, Carolina, I don't know if they want to add something. Fatima.
Okay. Um, if there's anything that group one wants to add, maybe we can hear from them. Also, if you feel like, we've covered it all, communication is also about knowing, when enough has been said. So,
I cannot talk instead of the other girls from the group, but I think more or less we were talking about the same points that were already mentioned. So personally, I wouldn't have anything to add, but maybe the others have some ideas.
okay, thank you, Lillian. Okay, I see we have a hand from Cecilia. You can go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, I'm from group three, but I just wanted to add something, maybe a bit controversial, we'll see. But it's just that the second option that we have, I would argue that depending on our target, it will be more appreciated because, for example, big philanthropies, they need to see and they need to be educated about what the problem actually is. And I think that the second version shows better what the problem is, while the first one is a bit more general, maybe more adapted to UN frameworks, let's say. But with big philanthropic or even smaller actually philanthropic foundations that know nothing about gender stuff, they would maybe appreciate the level of detail that the second one gives compared to the first one.
Yeah, so maybe the first one is more what you would put in a donor report. The second one would be in a proposal potentially. But
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yes.
yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Um, Wondering if there's maybe one or two more people who have something to share so we can kind of go in. I do have another exercise that I would love us to go through as well. So just wanting to be conscious of everyone's time. Abichi, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I don't remember which group I was in, but so I think we kind of spoke from the lens of the donor, like not putting the onus on the organization who is, applying for funding, but where does donors come from? Yeah, like what are their understanding and what are their thoughts for accepting those applications, which is also like it's not always so clear. It's also different from where they are based, what kind of work they support, and of course, if it's a corporate entity, then their way of seeing will be different. And if it's a feminist funding organization, they would prefer the second one because that has more probably a lot of work that they might be doing, bringing in that kind of emotion. So I think, yeah, that's most of us were like around, that's what we were talking about.
Okay, super. Thank you. And I can see others from your group are also adding in. But yes, thank you all for unmuting. Thank you all for coming and speaking and having a conversation with people who you have never met before in your life. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate that engagement. And I'm also, learning and reflecting from your perspectives. But I think what's really coming out here is the fact that version A felt almost like something of a betrayal of version B, in some ways, but also the fact that version A and version B could potentially be utilized for different audiences. And I think those two kind of lessons and learnings are really in line with what I also wanted to highlight, in the sense that I think in the context that we are in right now, we are definitely having to tweak and adjust based on the different audiences. And sometimes that can honestly feel a bit like a cop out where we're selling out. I think especially like, for example, the work that I do is very much rooted in the communities that I've come from. And sometimes when I have to change the things that I've learned from my communities into donor speak, it feels like I am betraying the very people who are the reason why I'm here today. Um, And so within my communications practice, something that I've been toying around with is practicing feminism without the word in particular. So we're in this position now where simply saying the word feminism in and of itself is something that is looked down upon, something that is in some instances even criminalized. And so I always ask myself the question of if I am to communicate in a specific way, if it's even subconsciously whatever the person feels in that communication, whatever that person receives with that communication, should in and of itself embody what I believe my feminist practice to be. And so I get to practice that feminism without actually utilizing the word. Um, and just to kind of speak through, the space that we are in terms of the contradictions that we have as well, and the fact that, we are having to navigate some of these things. I want to offer a bit of a reframing, looking at the famous line that I think we all know from Audre Lorde, um, which is the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that very much rings true. Obviously, then it really, I think, describes that sense of if I am having to speak and communicate in a way that is fulfilling the mandate of, larger corporations that are directly contributing to my own oppression and the oppression of people like me, then I am just trying to I'm basically using the master's tools in many ways. But the reality of it all, I think in many of these scenarios, is the fact that we are working within the master's house, and it is not necessarily a betrayal to be able to strategically use ambiguity as a form of political intelligence. Where this kind of where I ground myself and I root myself in this knowledge is recognizing that in many different instances across history, there have been moments where people have had to strategically communicate certain things in order to push what is really the core praxis of what it is they're trying to get at. Um, in many ways, the far right has done an incredible job of lobbying over the last 30 years. Project 2025 was something that was envisioned to take 40 years, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, for example, but it ended up taking 30. And in many ways, what they, I think, successfully have done is going in and sitting and listening to the ways in which we are speaking and we are talking and trying to frame language in that way to then shift the tide, and be able to use that knowledge against us. We do not have to replicate the intent behind the master's tools, but we can use the master's tools as a means to break down the master's house. And so within enslaved communities, coded language is always being used. People have translated things through songs. Queer communities have created safety in hostile spaces by using what can be understood as coded language. And I think that can be a basis and a root and a framing that we can use as we're doing these communications, with the obvious caveat that in some instances we don't have to do that. And those instances are very important. And later on, I'm kind of going to go into how we can almost feed the sense of we are having to work within this specific context right now. It doesn't mean we have to give up, but there are some things, especially within communication through joy, and emotion, that I think can definitely feed us as we navigate some of this space. And I really think what's important when we are doing this and trying to figure out how we can communicate things by recognizing that, like, to do some of the work that's going to push a different narrative, we do need to have access to resources, funding, time in many ways. And we have to, in the positions that we are in, where we are predominantly working in these spaces, where we have access to media and all of those things, what is our role in the ecosystem? And how can we translate that? I think what's the big distinction here is looking at strategic translation versus depoliticization. Strategic translation ensures that the politics are intact. So we are never taking away from the political. We are never taking away from the fact that to be able to communicate in and of itself is a form of resistance. Depoliticization, on the other side, takes away the politics. presents people's struggles and lived experience as some form of an objective fact and removes the fact that there's power embedded in the ways in which people experience certain things. And mainly, I think the question and the guiding force that I have when it comes to making the decision, because sometimes the line can get a bit blurry, is really, has the language changed because someone is uncomfortable? And that question can be not as cut and dry sometimes because, okay, for example, I think in many ways, the reason why we are having to write reports for donors and everything with specific language is because someone's uncomfortable. Someone's just feeling like, I don't like that word because it makes me have to sit and think about my privilege. But I think if you're asking the question of really and truly, is this language that I'm using putting certain people at risk? Is this language that I'm using actually going to have concrete ramifications if I use it in this specific way? And are there other ways in which I can communicate this without taking out the politics? Those kind of guiding questions can help with making that distinction. But for example, there was a time when I wrote something and it was taken down because it was seen as, certain things where it should not be said in any way. But when I wrote it, I felt like I had used very kind of matter-of-fact language and described a situation. And when it came down to it, it was really because one person had read this article and felt like it was uncomfortable for them to reconcile with some of these things. But in reading it, I did not feel like I was using language that was directly going to put anyone at risk, that was not going to put the organization I was working for at risk. And if there were questions to be asked about what it is that I was saying, I knew that I could answer them in a way that also emanated the fact that my feminism and my praxis is what is guiding me. And being able to open up the conversation of, is this something that you really feel is a harm, or is it something that just for you has forced you to reconcile with some of these things? So, having had thought through that and looking through some of these frameworks, I think a concrete example of how we can start thinking of this distinction in many ways is kind of the theory of intersectionality brought forward by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I bring this as an example, as a preamble to us then going into another exercise where I would like for us to translate a few statements to kind of see what that kind of looks like. And we actually have practical examples before we kind of go into more of the joy and the different mediums that we can use to also push a bit of what can be defined as the radical. So when I think of Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, what it really was actually was describing what had been spoken about in especially Black feminist circles for years before, but it was the way in which it was translated for people to understand in a language that people understood. And I use language here not in the terms of what phonetically you say, but more so people can understand the situation in different ways. And I think what her framing of intersectionality successfully did was not taking away the politics, but rather just explaining to people in a way that could be applicable in their everyday lives. And I think at this point right now, a lot of our communications work is doing that. And sometimes it does mean that we can't use a specific word or we can't use specific language, but we are still able to at least put it in such a way that I want to say when the tide has passed, people still remember the principle at play, and the narratives that we're trying to shift are still being mobilized in that way. So, to kind of make sense of all of this, I'm someone who learns through actually doing. And so, this is just another exercise. Now, I realize if people could maybe no, we will just come in and we will copy paste it again. But just wanting people to go into further breakout groups, if we can maybe perhaps have it for, I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'm not gonna cut this one down because I think it's worth it. But working through translating this specific text into the three different audiences so we can have a bit of the muscle exercised of recognizing that different contexts require different things, but also that we are not betraying what we are doing by communicating in a specific way, but rather that coded language has been utilized by numerous demographics for the longest time to keep pushing a narrative, whilst in the same breath realizing that we are working in very restricted contexts. So, Lucky, once again, I will go ahead and ask if you could put us into breakout groups.
Hi, Simone. Were you able to paste the questions in the group? Sorry, you're muted again.
Wow, look at that. Today, yes, I was able to go into all the groups, so everyone has a question. So we can give it until I want to say 8 minutes past the hour. So we can, I would say, no, I would actually say, yeah, about 8 minutes past the hour to give people enough time. But yeah,
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to
okay,
take a small bathroom break, but I'll be back.
sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. In from the breakout rooms. So once again, I think less so of a question of what did you come up with, because I believe most of us here probably engage in some form of communications, and you're constantly being asked, can you fix this messaging? Can I see the text? So I'm not going to ask you to come and offer that from your groups, but instead to open up the space to answer some of the questions that were at the bottom of the exercise that I gave. That, it's like, what did you keep? What did you lose? Where did you feel like this was a betrayal? And where did you feel like you were actually engaging in crafting information in a way that's strategic and could allow for people to get better access to what they need? And I think I'll just allow people to put their hands up. I will give us fortunately, about 5 to 7 minutes for this, just so I can run through the rest and then hopefully have a bit of point for questions. But if anyone feels inclined to share, that would be great. Otherwise, also just great that you engage in the activity. Yes, Caroline.
Thank you. I think in our group, we're room one. We were in room one. We have Lydia and other colleagues, and we decided, in regard of the time, that maybe each of us choose like a version that we just rewrite, and then I was in the donor version, and then I just lose a lot of things. I lost a lot of things rewriting it because the term conservating framing requirement just really I have to remove term like patriarchal because I know that it would just you know I don't know it would not be comfortable for the donors. Also the term control of women economic independence. I really just I don't know, it was so emotionless and heartless, for example, if I can just read my sentence, it was like by investing in women economic freedom, health choices, and mobility, we unlock leadership at every level. And our program breaks down barrier to create an equitable future for all. So it's just like, the feminist, I lost my feminist voices in it, like even the power, I don't know how to say it in English, sorry. Um, you just remove, I don't know, all the things that was so precious for women. We talk about women that can have access to control, independence. We certainly remove reproductive choices because we know that for now, it's just, if we're talking about conservative donors, you just have to remove it because in their mind right now, this means a lot of things. And also freedom of women, of movement, because uh, uh, for us, patriarchal structure, for example, where I come from in Cameroon, is mostly linked to traditional values. But if you put that, it's the traditional norms that limit women economic independence. For sure, the conservative donor will not be comfortable with it. So that's for my part. So sorry, my English is
Yeah.
broken. I'm coming from a
No,
francophone country.
c'est pas grave. That's completely fine, and thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I think clearly, I think all of us in this room know how to play the game. But really, I think what this space hopefully can provide is that ability to just sit there and say, this is what it felt like. This is what I feel like was lost. And I hope the next portion where I can provide some of the other outlets where we can still engage in kind of the joy and the resistance, and ensuring that there's a bit of a balance. But thanks for sharing that. I'm actually going to say if there's one more person who has something else to say, just for the purposes of time. Yes, Natasha, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Not sure if this is the kind of reflection or thought process anyone else had, but I think when we did the exercise and we were looking at the community version, I felt like that was the most difficult for me because that is us talking directly to the community that we want to serve and work with. And I think oftentimes um people in our sector don't think enough about the language that we use. And for me, for example, I overthink everything, like every single word I say. And I think in that situation as well, I was like, okay, how do we say it in a way that makes them feel seen, reminds them that they are the ones with agency, and that, to avoid any like instances of like, white saviorism and all that. So I think that was another like mental loop I went into during the exercise, but I think it's also like a really important reflection. Just thought to share
No.
that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's very important. I think also just brings to the forefront that in doing communications, we are trying to translate information for very distinct audiences. I know if I was to go into my context and just mouth off about patriarchal structures, that would actually be a way of closing people off from what I'm trying to communicate. At the same time, I'm saying, this is where I'm rooted and this is where my knowledge comes from. So it really is all about kind of spending a bit of time with that. And I think I will speak about this later as well, but I also think as we're doing communications, a lot of what is required for us to push forward, what I think feminist praxis is pushing forward for, is the way in which we work as well. So the way in which we do communications, being able to set that boundary to say, no, I need time to reflect, and cannot just throw out, deliverable after deliverable, because you are doing the complex work of translating things for different communities, different contexts, and in an increasingly hostile environment as well. You're really having to think of what the code is and how you can use that in different places. So thank you very much for that reflection. And I wish I could hear more from others, and hopefully we can have more of these sessions. But I just wanted to kind of walk people through um, in just some of the practical, perhaps, examples that I have here, um, or rather some of the reflections and how we can engage in joy. So again, a lot of the feminists thought leaders that I particularly engage in have always really spoken about joy as praxis, actually as part of my work with CoFem, create a feminist joy toolkit, because really this is the crux of everything that guides me. But I do think that as we are also navigating this anti-gender world, it's really important for us to engage in ways that in other epochs of history, people have done certain things to sustain themselves, and should be part and parcel of what we speak about when we say communications within this context. And so, um, I think memes as resistance really is how I phrased it, because I think that's an avenue where you don't have to say much. But those who know, know. And I think sometimes it's really important as communicators that we are reminding people that the narrative still lives, that the movement is still alive. And I think memes and pictures and references that people are engaging in can be a really great way to engage in that, joy as resistance, because in many ways we are being suffocated of practicing joy, using humor as well, which I think is very much aligned with the memes as resistance, and kind of engaging in that. But I think you have to have a bit of a giggle. You have to make people giggle because, like I said before, when you're communicating, and if you want to ask the question, how can I communicate feminism without using the word? If people can remember whenever they engage in whatever it is you are communicating, or whenever they engage with the thing that you're communicating about, interventions or certain, narrative shifts or whatever, if they can remember joy, the brain naturally affiliates that with whatever it is that you are speaking about. And I think people are more likely to kind of start deeply reflecting with a lot of these things, because if there's one thing that the far right does not know how to do is to communicate things without fear. And so I think if we can provide joy as a counter to that, I think we can get to some place where at least we have a collective consciousness that is rooted in joy, in everything that we do. Um, Voice notes and oral communication, I think can also be really innovative ways of sharing that stuff. So sometimes just mouthing off, or sometimes in small group dynamics. I work for an abortion network, for example, and sometimes, what could have easily been an email, we have a closed group and we use that as a means to share that. Because I think even when I'm engaging in conversation with people, sometimes just sitting there and hearing their voice, that resonance in and of itself can be helpful. And again, going back to how can we do feminism without saying the word? How are people feeling when we're communicating to them, when we're communicating about them? How do they feel when they hear about themselves through our own communication? Um, and also the aesthetics. I love to play with color whenever I'm doing certain things, and going against the typical corporate marketing grain of dark blue. Sorry to the people who work for the UN. That's always been my caveat, is that that blue is hard for me. Um, but I think if you can, in some ways, bring in color and bring in different things, again, it's really being able to expand people's minds. Because if there's one thing again that the far right does really well is they're consistent in the way in which they portray certain things, and there's a very specific image. But the thing that comes to mind when you see that image oftentimes is fear, because that is how they get people to follow them and listen to them. If we can play with color and play with sound and the different ways in which we can communicate, we can also cultivate joy in affiliation to feminism. And there will be a day where we can say feminism again, and the first thing that comes to mind for people is the joy and the beauty and the color. And this really does resonate across the board. And it's the way in which communities have engaged in resistance across millennia for a really long time. And do not make people believe that this emotional side, the play side, is not something that's productive or useful for communications. It is the bedrock of it all, because we are doing translation work and we need to be able to understand the lived experience of people and what it means to exist in their bodies and have all this sensory input. And so if we can play with a lot of that stuff, we can also transform the way in which we're transmitting information. Um, and yes, rest and softness. This is what I think I was speaking to as well, is that not just what we're communicating, but how we formulate these communications is very important. And I do not say that lightly, in the sense that even within my day-to-day practice and doing my work, I still find that it's challenging, because yes, we are resource constrained, and oftentimes we are trying to do a lot more than we have been allowed to actually do, the resources allowing us to do. But I really do think that that's important as well, because we have to shift the way in which people also receive information. We are in a space where people are being inundated so much with information all the time. And I think it is much better for you to communicate something that is well thought out and actually thinks of all these different elements in a slower cadence than doing it in such quick succession, which I think a lot of marketing strategies will convince you need to do for relevance and for the algorithm. But I really do think there is an in between that you can strike. And in just engaging and working that muscle, you can very easily get to a point where you feel a bit more comfortable in doing that. And so, just speaking to kind of some very practical tools that you can also have. These are just some reflection points that you can always bring yourself to. And sometimes people are asking you for 10 designs by the next day, a whole campaign, and you don't have time for that. But I think, at least on a quarterly level, what I like to do is to sit down and reflect about these things. And this can be something that you can incorporate in your own work, whether that's in a joint group meeting or something like that, to say, just running it back, the communications plan that we had. Let's just check, who are we communicating for? How are we communicating? What modalities are we using? What challenges are we facing? And having that space to collectively reflect about that. And I will share this presentation so you have these as well. Um, and then these are just also some really practical actions that I've thought through and I think could be really helpful. I know we spoke about, how do we really accurately amplify some of the community knowledge that we are basing our communications on. And I think building a community lexicon is really important. So listening, learning, and having an active living document or something that collects the ways in which people are talking about these things. One of my biggest qualms is the way in which people would say, for example, queerness is something that's not discussed in certain cultures that are not Western. But when you actually go and you sit and you listen, you realize that queerness was being described in so many different ways, beyond what you're doing in the bedroom. And having that resource of knowledge, I think, is really important, but also grounds us in the ways in which we're communicating and provides us with an easier way of then translating. Because oftentimes, if the only source of information or knowledge you're getting is from the perspective of the person who you're trying to translate your knowledge for, you end up feeling like you're doing the inverse, but really it should be a situation where you're rooting it in the community language and then translating it. And that's just an iterative process that you have to go through. Spokespeople are a myth. Let's not, one person doesn't have to speak for everyone. And even if you have people who you feel like, yes, they can walk into a room and they command the attention of others, other people can also go into a room. And sometimes the mere fact that they are not the person who commands attention and people are like, oh, maybe this is not someone who is the best at orally speaking. Guess what? They still remember that person, didn't they? And so we can play a lot with those things and change the way in which we, try to position people who are the most articulate or speak a specific language, which goes again to the multi-register approaches, really just not saying that one language is the only one that we can use to communicate. And I think moving between some of those different ways in which we speak can also mean that, like one word in English is now for donor something that is unacceptable, but you can slide in a local language in reporting and you can have your little subtext at the bottom that describes what that is without using its direct translation. And I think that's a way to also, for yourself, know that you're maintaining the politics behind the things that you're communicating. Um, I think also just based off of the work that I've done, something that's also very important is to have protocol in many ways. We are in a space where there's access to communication and its tools. And given that, there are also people who are working just as hard to counteract what you're doing. And so sitting there and thinking, okay, how can we, if something is to happen, if we're to run into an issue, how can we address this? What does that look like? And just developing a plan. And I think the last thing that I will kind of pick up and highlight from this as well is really developing a practice of documenting oral histories. A lot of knowledge is lost, a lot of communication is lost because it's not being put down on paper. And then it's not seen as valid enough information. But just tying to, building that community lexicon, talk to people. And sometimes you document, you keep the information, but it doesn't have to go out there. It doesn't have to be out there. But the fact that it lives and exists is part and parcel also of our communication work, in that we do not want to lose the things that we have right now, because we know, and feminists have for the longest time known, that the sun will shine at some point. The sun will always come up every day. And so if we're able to retain that information and ensure that there's going to be moments where we can actually speak openly about these things, that we have the information to openly speak about. And so, yes, that is me and my um, brief kind of overview of some of the communication praxis. I really like this statement from Audre Lorde, which is poetry is not a luxury. It's a vital necessity of our existence. It forms a quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change. And if we were to replace poetry here with communications, the statement still runs true. So, yeah, I think this is just the ways in which I think through some of these things. Now I see we have technically 2 more minutes. I'm going to open up the floor if anyone has any questions and ask that maybe we can go 5 minutes past the time. But if people have other things to do, that's also completely okay. But I'm going to open it up to any questions and reflections. And I promise, as we're working through these learning huddles, we're going to figure out a modality that actually allows us to sit, have chats, have a conversation, especially for the communication scrolls, because I think, it's always good to have that community. So yeah, opening that up for anyone. Emma, please go ahead. I see your hand first.
Hi, I actually wanted to ask, is there some way to stay connected with you after this?
Yes, I am going to, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm going to put that here. And then I'm also going to share my email.
Thank you so much.
That's correct. Okay, here we go. I'm just reading some of the chats in. resonating so hard. Like, yeah. Please give me time to read so I can come and, you know, provide more information. But yes.
I want to ask you first, thank you, and thanks to all the ladies who were present today. I just have a question. At the beginning, you mentioned a quote about communication, but I forgot what you said exactly. I wanted to write it down, but I can't remember. Do you
Oh my
remember?
gosh. Did I say it or was it on the
Yeah, you
screen?
did. Yeah, you first you mentioned the one about you said what is order if not chaos put together. That I memorized it already, as you can see. And then you said
Before that?
communication.
Do you know what context it was in?
Just when we were joining the rooms, you would just, creatively mention a quote, like
Wow.
we were being distributed and you were like mentioning quotes. Yeah, but
Okay. No, you've given me some hints. It's gonna come to me. I see that Fatimat had another question, but it'll come to me. Zainab, and you've given me enough cues. I'm just gonna have to sit and think for a second. Yes. Okay, I see Rifat. You have your hand up too?
Yeah, hi. Something it's not specific to donor related, but just in general with communication with people. Something that I see in NGO circles in India is that they want the communication to be like peaceful, joyful, as in to a point that they want to avoid any kind of rage or any kind of negative feelings, as they say. Like there shouldn't be that. So whenever you talk about feminism, it's more about like some angry women shouting, and this is the whole scenario. No one wants to associate with it. And I'm just like thinking about, I understand when you talk about like joy and stuff, but then for me, I think it becomes very hard when someone wants to talk about rage and that's just shut down as a negative, wrong emotion. And I don't know like how to navigate this. What do you think about that? I don't know. Yeah, this is
Yeah,
something
I
that came
think
to my mind.
I think I totally resonate with that, and joy is never a replacement for rage. I think one cannot exist without the other. And I definitely think that within feminism, and when we say that we want people to remember feminism without the actual word, I do think it's important that people also remember that feminists rage when there is injustice and things are not okay. Because sometimes people feel that they themselves are not allowed to rage and they're not allowed to be angry about certain things. And sometimes that means, you have to take that on, but also within a context of taking care of yourself. And so I'm always a believer of trying to have that balance in many ways. And ultimately, we are doing the work of translation. We are not doing the work of appeasement. And so sometimes people are going to be uncomfortable. But their discomfort should not be a reason why we continue to accept the systems that we're existing in. But always practice joy and then rage sometimes. Life has balance. That's how I would approach it. Okay, I see we have question from Caroline, or rather your hand is raised, Caroline.
Yes, it's not really a question, but like for us to maybe open the conversation as well, because I know that we were mostly focusing on communication with donors or in our organization, but sometimes I also think that when it comes to feminist communication with the communities, you also have to restrict yourself. For example, in Cameroon, the only the mention of feminism in maybe when you work with community is really not a good perceive here. And then, for example, we have workshop tomorrow with uh, women with disabilities, and in regard of them to make sure that they will be there, we just have to remove the word feminist or feminism in the term of reference to make sure that they will attend. They won't be afraid because, like Rifat was saying, we're considered as angry women who just want to, I don't know, who want to just fight against the African tradition. So even with communities, you have to sometimes restrict yourself. And I like understand because they are more like we want also to they're also in the process of learning, but sometimes it's very difficult. And sometimes you're working with a communities for 2, 3 years, 5 years, and you still cannot really identify yourself clearly as feminist. So that's just for like open the conversation as well while we are working with communities.
Yes, 100%. And really thank you for bringing that forward because I think we speak of the anti-gender world and obviously for a lot of the work that we're doing, because the people who have power, the people who have resources, and so sometimes that comes front of mind. But for millennia as well, the notion of feminism, especially white feminism, has been used to divide and conquer many demographics. And so sometimes using that word, many people may not identify with it, but that doesn't mean that they don't resonate with the container in which it's being used or the system in which it's being used to describe. And so that is also very important. And sometimes, again, we're doing the work of translation and it's a question of, once again, did you change the word feminism because people were uncomfortable? And in that instance, it wasn't just discomfort. It's the mere fact of people coming in to be able to have the conversation and get access to necessary resources. And so in that instance, translation is necessary. And that's also a way in which we can practice the act of feminism without the word. And I think that's where a lot of that reflection comes from for me is really the fact that many women from the communities that I work in do not identify as feminist because the way in which it was presented to them from a white feminist perspective was not conducive to their lived experience. So yeah, that's very crucial and I think also a really important thing to remember that our communications, even though the people who have power want to convince us is predominantly for them, is really for ourselves and the communities that we're a part of. So, yes. And with that, I would say because we are now 6 minutes past the hour, or rather 6 minutes past the 90 minutes we were supposed to work with, I mean to close us off here. I will send a follow-up, which will have the presentation, as well as some of the readings that I provided. Hopefully, I can find some open source options so we can dive into that a bit. And yes, as Lucky has so gracefully put in this information about joining CoFem and being a part of it. We have a lot more things in store. There's also a lot of different thematic leads that are doing a lot of this important work. So if you work in cross-cutting themes and things like that, please feel free to join us, and you can be part of the working groups as well. But I really just want to take the time to thank everyone. As someone who works in communications, I know you don't have time. I know they're not giving you all the time. So really thank you so much for being here. I hope this was helpful. And please, amongst ourselves as well, stay in touch. The community is there. And really, for the communication goals, you're not alone. Goals is neutral. But thank you.
I'm sorry, Simone. Fast question. Where can we find